Hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. And following Homecoming, I started to get a bit of a Spider-Man itch. As I talked about in that video, I do like the MCU Spider-Man films, and I think Tom Holland might be the best live-action version of Spider-Man. But I've never happily had a complete, satisfying Spider-Man story. In the same way as X-Men, I think, has the same problem. And I often wonder if the problem is with the films or with the fact that I grew up in a generation who were introduced to both Spider-Man and X-Men through their animated series in the 90s. The problem is that Spider-Man and X-Men are both characters or groups of characters who really suited a serialized, the storytelling style that, allows complex characters, lots of villains, rogues galleries, quite a lot of interplay. And it's very hard to then encapsulate that into live-action films because live-action storytelling is quite streamlined, it's quite simple, it can't be as visually complex as these comics or the 90s series. It's funny, really. Most people of my age were probably introduced to comic book properties either through that 90s series or the X-Men 90s series. And so, as much as I like Tom Holland's current MCU run, it still, to this day, felt like there's something lacking, something that doesn't fully capture the world of Spider-Man in a way that can completely represent it. And then, out of nowhere, this little film came, this animated film that, to be honest, didn't get much of a fanfare before it came out, and then started to build up a little bit of steam. And then, of course, it was said that Miles Morales was going to be the Spider-Man of this. And then they said it was going to be a multiverse picture. And then I went to see it with no real expectations because it was a very complex idea. And this might be the best, most definitive Spider-Man feature film that I've ever seen. I mean, Spider-Man is definitely one of those characters, and I talked in the last video about how Spider-Man is Marvel's Batman, or to Marvel what Batman is to DC. He is the flagship hero. He is, when people think superheroes, they think Batman, they think Spider-Man. That's sort of your defaults. And the problem you have with that is the fact that, obviously, with Spider-Man, it's quite difficult because Spider-Man is supposed to be the everyman character. He's supposed to be relatable. And the story of Spider-Man primarily is the story of puberty and the story of being the outsider, being the loner, being someone who doesn't quite fit in, and sort of finding your own path, even though you feel weird and different to other people. And this story has been consistent since, his inception in the 60s and has adapted to each decade, each era, as Spider-Man has adjusted and adapted. And we just assumed, as comic book property fans do, that, well, it's just Peter Parker is Spider-Man and that is the way it will be. And similarly, I mean, there were other Spider-Men. There was Ben Parker. Oh, sorry, is it Ben Parker? So it wasn't, and of course Miles O'Hara, who was the Spider-Man of 2099, so it wasn't like the idea of new Spider-Man was entirely original. But then Miles Morales came in, and of course he was introduced in the Ultimate Spider-Man run, and he was introduced as the replacement Spider-Man after the death of Peter Parker. And that might have meant nothing, because that happens, comic books, characters die and come back all the time. But Miles Morales injected a new perspective on Spider-Man. a new way of sort of a new revitalization of the original Spider-Man story. In the same way that people get frustrated with Superman and the fact that Superman, a lot of audiences want Superman to no longer be the young 30-year-old who's single and doing stuff. They want him. A lot of people want Superman to be married to Lois Lane and have sons, and the story be about fatherhood and about the personal and the broader, how you can be a Superman whilst also being a person through that perspective. Similarly, a lot of people have argued for decades how Spider-Man should get older, should adapt, and his issues should be broader. But comic books being what they are, everything gets reset. And there was a period where they tried to introduce, have Peter Parker and Mary Jane married and tried to sort of move him forward, but there was always that push and pull. And then you think about Miles Morales and you think, perhaps this is the way that you get both. You can have Peter Parker move on, get older, and yet at the same time, Spider-Man's story still needs to be a story of puberty and sort of being a bit of an outside loner who doesn't fit in. And Miles Morales, particularly in this film, really suits that mould. His story really feels like the contemporary retelling of the Spider-Man story, but of course with some changes. And of course, in Into the Spider-Verse, the way they address that is you have multiple Spider-Men. You have the original Spider-Man of this story, who, and mild spoilers, but it's in the first act, is killed. You have Miles Morales, who's just become Spider-Man and has no idea how to, this is day one of being Spider-Man for him. And then they introduce Jake Johnson's Peter B. Parker, of course part of the big multiverse story. And you get the older Spider-Man, and you realise, okay, Spider-Man doesn't grow into becoming this Iron Man, Tony Stark type, confident master of everything. He's still a little bit weird and a little bit schlubby and a little bit of an outsider and doesn't fit in and has new issues to address. And that really works. It really works for the Peter Parker character. It really works for the Miles character. And their dynamic as sort of teacher and student, although sort of mismatched, not quite working together teacher-student, is really good in this film. It really shows how you can evolve the Spider-Man story. And I think what this film has to be credited with is the fact that it pushes the boundaries of animation, of visual storytelling, of the visual landscape, where it takes our understanding of, even if we've, people have never read a comic book or seen, they have a very basic understanding of Spider-Man, or they might have seen an animated TV series or film of a superhero. The way that the film perfectly blends multiple different visual styles to give you that comic book sense, whilst also giving you this different tones depending on different scenes and the introduction of different characters, whilst also still feeling like the most up-to-date animated technology. This is groundbreaking, the way that it tells this story. It really does evolve the way in which the visual landscape is can be perceived by or ingested by audiences. And it does that thing where it acknowledges the past. It does funny sequences like where the fight scenes happen. You actually have the pow, bops, as if you're watching a visual comic book. But it still feels fluid, and the motion feels organic, as if you're almost Uncanny Valley style watching real life. And it blends those perfectly. And then, of course, beyond just Peter Parker and Miles Morales, we get introduced to the whole host of Spider-Man characters, including Spider-Man Noir, Peter Porker, Gwen Stacy, and Penny Parker. And of course, each one represents a different comic book style. So Spider-Man Noir, of course, has that black and white, washed out style. You have the anime of Penny Parker, and you have the Looney Tunes style of Peter Porker. And again, the way it just seamlessly transitions from one different cartoon style to the other is extraordinary. It's genuinely an extraordinary way to blend these different storytelling techniques. And the thing, I think that, going back to what I said about how the trouble with Spider-Man in the live-action films is that he's limited by the streamlining of live-action storytelling. That if you look at the Tom Holland ones, say, they want to tell a high school story, they want to keep the villains fairly easy to follow, and it's more about teenager life than it is necessarily about superheroics, or there is a sort of parallel between them, but it doesn't want to push beyond that kind of story. With this, it manages to throw everything. You get the out-of-place teenager story, you get the huge multiverse threat, you get multiple different villains, some of whom only might get one scene, like the Kingpin, like Scorpion, Green Goblin, the Prowler, a different version of Otto Octavius. And you don't feel the need to be introduced to them because they are just a villain for the fight. Some of whom do get more complex stories, but some of whom are there because it makes a good, cool fight. And I honestly don't know how they would do that in live action. I'm not sure if they could. But the way that it manages to put everything into this film and give you, with all of this going on, rich character work and quite personal, quite, mournful stories where it's not, it might be a family film, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have deeper, more complex ideas. As I said yesterday, when I was talking about, not yesterday, a couple of days ago, when I was talking about Luca, and the fact that the trouble was that Luca struggled to balance the personal with the bigger ideas. This is a demonstration of how you do a personal story about being a son and being, fatherhood and childhood, and also having a relationship with, family members who might not be as honourable or as admirable as you think they are, and the different family dynamics. And yet it still be a Spider-Man story, and a multiversal Spider-Man story. So you can see that this is such a rich and complex film, and of course it deserved to win the Oscar for animation. It, without doubt, it deserved to win that year. And it's such a good story. Like I said, this to me might be the best, most definitive Spider-Man story, because, and again, I said this during Homecoming, the problem with Spider-Man in the MCU is that he feels very small, very neighborhood Spider-Man, and Spider-Man has to both be small fry, but also flagship, and it's a very difficult line to walk. Now, as things have panned out, I don't know if it was in reaction to this film, or whether it was always the plan, but it looks as though Spider-Man No Way Home is really veering towards a much bigger idea and a much grander sense of Spider-Man in terms of scale, with suggestions that it might go back to Raimi Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire, or Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man, and some of the villains and some of the characters from those franchises might be all crossing over in some big Spider-Man event. Now, we'll see if that all happens, and we'll see if that works. But failing that, we have this. And I know they're planning their own mini animated franchise just out of this alone. But putting that sort of aside, putting the big business structure of it aside, this film is such a definitive idea about that returns to the idea of power and responsibility what it means to be Spider-Man and what it means to grow up. That, in spite of all the big plans for live action, animated, everything else that's going on, this film in isolation is probably the most definitive Spider-Man story. That if I was to say to someone, someone was to say to me, what is the definitive Spider-Man story to get someone into the character of Spider-Man? This is the one. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video because it will help me in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that little bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of over 150 videos and follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I'm always tweeting about TV shows and films, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.